Hello guys, my name is Piros Katsis and today we're going to talk about middlewares. If you are fairly new to ASP, maybe you have seen them, all that stuff in the program.cs like use authentication and use authorization, and the one should be prior to the other, etc. And maybe you know how to create one and you have an idea about how it will behave, but you don't fully understand it. So I'll go and open a diagram that I made. And in here we have our request that can be sent through our application, Postman, etc. And finally we have our endpoint in our application that is just the bare minimum API that you get out of the box. Our endpoint is the get endpoint to the weather forecast controller. So our request won't go directly to this endpoint, but instead it will go through a pipeline that consists of middlewares and action filters. So if that's our request, it will go to our first middleware, then to our second middleware, then to our final middleware, then it will go through action filters. We won't talk a lot about action filters in this video. And then finally it will get to our endpoint. Now the order of that middlewares is similar to the order that we register in that program.cs. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to create a new middleware and I will call that authentication middleware. Okay, and I'm going to inject a request delegate. We will talk about that in a minute. So private read-only request delegate, and we will call that next. And let's initialize that through the constructor. And now we need to specify what will happen when our request arrives to that middleware. So for that reason I'm going to create a public async task invoke, and I will receive the HTTP context. So HTTP context, and now I want to implement my dummy authentication logic. So I will check in the headers for a key value pair with a key named key. So context.request.headers.try get value, and I want to store that value in a variable called value. Okay, and now if we don't have in the headers a key with a key named key, so if not has key or the value of the key it's not equal to, let's say, 1, 2, 3, at that point I want to throw an exception because I want to handle all my request failures somewhere else. So let's go and create that exception. So public class unauthorized exception, and we need to inherit from the exception class. Okay, let's create the constructor. Okay, and now in here let's throw that exception. I forgot the new. Okay, excellent. And now if we are authenticated, we want to forward our request to the next element in the pipeline. That could be a middleware again, or an action filter, or our endpoint. So we will do that by invoking that request delegate, and let's pass the context. Okay, now so if we go back to our diagram and let's remove the other stuff, that's our request, and it will go to our authentication middleware. Let's make that smaller so we can have the code as well. So it will go to our authentication middleware. It will implement the authentication logic, and if the user is authenticated, in line 21 we forward the request to the next middleware. So let's register our middleware. So I'm going to program.cs and remove that use authentication, and I'll say app use middleware, and we want to use our authentication middleware. Okay, let's debug this, and I'll open Postman, and I have already created a request with the appropriate headers. So I will call that endpoint, and I will get back the weather forecast. But if I change the value to 1, 2, we get a 500 internal server error, and with all the details about our exception. Now that's something we do not want. So I'm going and create an exception middleware. So exception middleware, and we will have again our delegate. So private read only request delegate next. We will initialize that through the constructor. Now we will have our public async task invoke. Okay, and now we want to surround all the other actions in a try catch block. So try, and await next, and let's pass the context. Okay, and now we want to catch an exception. Let's call that ex, and in here let's create another method to handle our exceptions. So private static task handle exception, and we will need the HTTP context and the exception. And now we want in the context.response.status code, which will be the status code that the user will receive, to switch on that exception. So exception switch, and if it's an unauthorized exception, we want the status code to be 401 unauthorized. So, and we need to cast that to an int. So HTTP status code dot unauthorized. Okay, else we don't care right now. So we will set that to internal server error. So HTTP status code dot internal server error. Okay, and let's return a completed task. Okay, so in our catch block we will await that handle exception, and we will pass the context and the exception. Okay, let's register our middleware. Now let's go to our program.cs and let's register the exception middleware. Let's run that again and see what happens. So I will call that, and we get back the same 500 internal server error with the exception and all the details about it. Now, why is that happened? Because, as I said in the start of the video, the order that our middlewares are going to invoke is the order that we register them. And as you can see here, I first registered the authentication middleware and then the exception middleware. So if we go back to our diagram, and if that's our authentication middleware and that's our exception middleware, we went to our authentication middleware, we threw an exception, but the middleware that was supposed to catch it was after the authentication middleware, so we didn't handle that exception. So now if I go and change the order, now our first middleware is the exception middleware, and we have surrounded that await next in a try catch block. So everything else that's going to happen in that journey of the request, it will be in that try block. So if I go and run that again, and let's put some breakpoints. So let's put one in our exception middleware and one in our authentication middleware, and let's call that. So we hit our first breakpoint, and let's continue the app, and now we hit our second breakpoint, and when that will throw, let's go back to our exception middleware and put a breakpoint in our catch block, we will catch it. So we will handle our exception, and as you can see, we get back 401 unauthorized. So that's how you register middlewares, and that's why their order is important. And now let me tell you that when we hit that endpoint, the request is not going to go back to whoever who called it directly, but again it will go through our pipeline, and that video is not about that, but let me just say that in our middleware, for example, everything that's after that line of code, it's going to be part of that returning over here. And for example, I could have in a middleware a stopwatch started before the await next, and I could stop the stopwatch after that line of code, and then I could have a metric about how long my request took. Anyway, that's all I had for this video. If you like that, please like and subscribe. Thank you for watching and have a nice one.